Ever find yourself pondering the concept of hell on earth? It's a difficult notion to grasp, but there's a place on this planet that fits the bill all too well. Welcome to the Prostitution Villages of Bangladesh, where the lives of women are shaped by exploitation, poverty, and social neglect. A place where despair reigns supreme. Thousands of women and girls work in these villages as prostitutes, sometimes voluntarily, most of the time not. It's a place where misery seems to have made its permanent residence, and escape is an unimaginable prospect, for even those who manage to break free often find themselves drawn back into this hellish existence. Let's peel back the layers of this harrowing reality, shedding light on the stories of those ensnared in its grasp. Bangladesh, which declares Islam the state religion, is renowned for its vibrant culture and deeply ingrained Islamic values. This is a country where premarital sex is widely frowned upon. You see, the religion of Islam strictly prohibits prostitution, and the country's constitution even discusses measures to combat it severely. But here's where it gets a little weird. Prostitution is actually legal in Bangladesh. Strange, isn't it? The country also has these laws against child prostitution, forced prostitution, and running unlicensed brothels. But when you look at what's happening on the ground, it's a whole different story. Hidden away in the countryside are whole villages dedicated to just that, where the reality doesn't match up with what the laws say. Understanding the existence of prostitute villages requires looking at the broader picture. You see, Bangladesh has been grappling with significant challenges for a while now. Things like poverty, limited access to education, and gender inequality. These issues create an environment ripe for exploitation. Especially in rural areas, life can be incredibly tough, with jobs being scarce and basic necessities like healthcare and schooling being hard to access. On top of that, outdated beliefs about the role and worth of women persist, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. And that's where these villages come into the picture. Take Daulatdia, a small village in the Rajbari district of Bangladesh, for instance. You might pass by it without a second thought, but those in the know understand its dark secrets. Daulatdia is not just any village. It's home to the largest brothel in Bangladesh and one of the largest in the world. It's so vast that it has its own economy, complete with tailors, beauty salons, tobacco shops, phone vendors, and grocery stores. Behind these shops, you'll find colorfully painted corridors leading to countless doors. Behind each one is a tiny room with a barred window and just enough space for a bed, where the girls are forced to sell their bodies. Running as one of the 20 officially sanctioned brothels in the country, Daulatdia serves more than 3,000 men daily. Estimates suggest there are between 1,300 to 2,000 sex workers in the village. The rest of the population is made up of pimps, drug dealers, bootleggers, food vendors, shopkeepers, laborers, and, heartbreakingly, around 951 children who live within the walls of the brothel. It's like a whole world within itself. And here's the worst part. It's a place where human trafficking, underage prostitution, and drugs are just part of everyday life. A bad traffic jam day is when business really picks up in Daulatdia. Trucks transporting goods queue for days, waiting for the ferry that will carry them over the river. And while they wait, many of them pass the time in the alleyways and rooms burrowed inside Daulatdia, paying for the company of women who depend on the meager income these grim periods bring. It's just gut-wrenching, isn't it? Now, let's get into something truly heartbreaking. Underage prostitution. Despite legal prohibitions, underage prostitution persists in Bangladesh. While the law permits prostitution only for individuals aged 18 and above, the reality is far bleaker. Newly arrived sex workers in establishments like Daulatdia have an average age of just 14, with some girls as young as 10 being forced into this trade. To evade legal scrutiny, pimps, who are usually older women and referred to as madams, resort to corruption, paying off law enforcement officials to falsify documents and register underage girls as legal workers. The younger the victim, the higher the bribe demanded, worsening the exploitation. What's particularly distressing is that many of these young girls are not there by choice, but are victims of human trafficking, sold into sex work for tiny sums, often as little as around $250 to the pimps. The kids who tragically find themselves in such circumstances spend their lives in a constant struggle. Some desperately seek ways to break free, while others accept themselves to their grim reality and cope by turning to drugs and alcohol readily available in their environment, which often leads to addiction. Take Mooney, for example, kidnapped on her way to school. She was sold by her abductor. Now 30 years old, she sees 5 or 6 clients a day, selling herself for the equivalent of just $2 each time.
I don't know where I was taken from. I was sold into it at about 8 years old. There was a woman who offered me 2 chocolates, and I followed her here. She brought me here, and then she sold me, and then she left through the back door.
And that's where Mooney's story ends. These days, she spends her days leaning against a doorway, smoking cigarettes and waiting for customers. As day turns to night, the streets around her turn ugly. Alcohol-soaked customers stream bright lights and loud music, and sex and violence become one. And it's not just sex trafficking that lands children in these prostitution centers. Circumstances also play a major role. See, life in a place like Bangladesh, where poverty casts a heavy shadow over daily existence, is a constant battle. And for many, it's a battle they're losing. Shockingly, more than half of the country's 60 million children live below the poverty line. These children are forced into child labor, a harsh reality born out of necessity. Especially for young girls working in factories or as domestic workers, the dangers are magnified. They face heightened risks of sexual exploitation and abuse in their daily lives, a grim reality they must confront. Sadly, the stigma attached to their situation runs deep, so much so that many of them feel like they have no other option but to run away in hopes of escaping the abuse. However, their attempts to flee often lead them to survival sex as their only means of getting by. Once involved in prostitution, their situation becomes even more dire, and they end up spending their entire lives in this cycle, often with no other options or places to turn to. Now let's zoom in on the heart-wrenching saga of Shumi, a young woman whose life took a disastrous turn. Shumi's story began in the humble confines of a poor household, where she learned early on the importance of hard work in supporting her family. With dreams of a brighter future, she envisioned herself leaving behind her rural home to work in a bustling garment factory, all to ease the burden on her parents. But alas, fate had far crueler intentions in store. Instead, the innocent kid got lured away by empty promises from an older woman, only to be sold off like a cheap trinket for less than $200. Now, she finds herself trapped in a dingy room in Daulatdia, engulfed by darkness. Cut off from her family completely and weighed down by shame, Shumi faces daily horrors, and the only solace she finds is in the bond she shares with other young girls trapped in this nightmare. Shumi's story isn't just tragic, it's a wake-up call. It's a stark reminder of the broken system that allows such exploitation to thrive. Shockingly, this exploitation can even occur at the hands of their own families, as in some instances, girls are sold by their own kin to brothels to endure years of chained sex service. And that's not all. As terrible as it may be, disabled children, those in institutions, and those uprooted by natural disasters such as floods are also vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Now let's take a closer look at the critical issue of healthcare, or rather the lack thereof, in these prostitution villages. In the gritty world of sex work and human trafficking, life for sex workers and victims is like something out of a horror movie. Just picture it, women and girls trapped in a never-ending cycle of exploitation, with their most basic health needs completely ignored and swept under the rug. Adding to the darkness are cultural and religious taboos that cast a long shadow over these communities. Healthcare workers and authorities often turn a blind eye to their suffering, leaving these vulnerable individuals stranded in a cycle of neglect and abuse. This is a place where things like family planning, sexual health, and maternal care are nothing but distant dreams for these women. It's a twisted reality where unprotected sex isn't just common, it's actively encouraged, leading to sky-high rates of HIV and unintended pregnancies. But here's the truly horrifying part. When these pregnancies do happen, the nightmare only gets worse. Many of these women are denied access to safe abortion care, resulting in devastating consequences. Abortion-related complications have become the leading cause of maternal death among female sex workers, a grim reality that highlights the brutality of their existence. And for those who do decide to carry their pregnancies to term, the challenges are immense. Without access to prenatal care, these women navigate the dangers of pregnancy alone, often unaware of the risks they face. In places like Daulatdia, where underage sex workers are tragically common, it's like living on a ticking time bomb. The fate of children born in these prostitution villages is heartbreaking and often bleak. They're exposed to the harsh realities of sex work and human trafficking from a young age, with little hope of breaking free from the cycle of exploitation. In some cases, these children, who are raised by their mothers, also end up becoming sex workers. Others may be taken in by relatives or caregivers within the village, but they still face the stigma and discrimination associated with their upbringing. But there appears to be a glimpse of hope, since a school for children born in brothels has recently been established. Because of their involvement with the brothel, they previously did not have access to education. The school provides an escape for many of the students, particularly the girls, who are pressured to enter the workforce. And that's it for today. But before you go, if you found yourself captivated by today's video, you won't want to miss our next one: the horrors suffered by comfort women during World War II. In this eye-opening exploration, we dive into the untold stories of one of history's darkest chapters. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay engaged.